welcome you to Matters of the Heart. My name is Steve Evans, and I'm here to talk with you about why your heart matters where your health is concerned. And with me is Angela McCurry, and she is going to be speaking about trauma with me, and then we have a special guest coming on a little bit later we'll introduce after the break. So Angela, we're talking today about trauma because it turns out that the mind-body connection is ruled by stress that we carried on the inside. And when our bodies break down under stress, there's a whole host of diseases ready to pounce on us, so to speak.
So much. There are so many people I meet that do not know that there was a connection between the mind and body. They don't understand those traumas that they experience, and they don't even know that that's a trauma. So I want to be able to get into explain exactly what a trauma is. But they don't know what that experience is to know if they got that in their lives, to know they even to address it. And that's what I'm excited about here today.
Well, let me get us started by reviewing the pathway by which a lot of disease comes upon us. And it happens like this. When we lose peace in our minds or hearts, then the stress goes into pulling our immune system down or throwing our body chemically or neurologically out of balance because the body wants us to be at peace.
Right.
And we lose peace because negative emotions come in and start throttling us, either fear and anxiety or anger or frustration, guilt or any number of things. But here's the point we're dealing with today, is that those negative emotions of the present reveal a breakdown of some kind of relationship of trust and love in the past. And that usually indicates a place where we've been traumatized.
Right.
So can you read for us Webster's definition of trauma?
You bet. So what is a trauma? Webster says it's a body wound or shock produced by physical injury as from a violence or an accident. It also tells us the condition that produces this is traumatism. It also will tell us that psychological shock or severe distress from experiencing a disastrous event outside the range of usual experience, such as a rape, military combat, or an airplane crash. It could be even not a tornado or an earthquake. Also, any wrenching or distressing experience causing a disturbance in the normal functioning.
All right, I like that definition, that last definition. They're all very good, but that last one I think everybody can relate to. It's any wrenching or negative experience that in some way captures our emotional system, and we know we've walked away from it, changed. We feel broken, or we feel injured, or we feel violated. And you think about experiences of automobile wrecks or people having great falls. I carry a scar on my arm from when I fell as a child, and that's been with me all my life. But you can have a trauma, but you can sometimes get over it. Sometimes it just tracks with you, and for a lot of women and men, it's been verbal and physical abuse in the home, sometimes sexual abuse in the home. Sometimes people have gone off to war and they haven't been able to recover from the trauma of the violence that they've seen and experienced. And so, folks, we really need somebody out there that can mend us of trauma. And I want to turn to, just for a second, to the scriptures. In Psalm 34, I was looking at the scripture, verse 19, where the psalmist says, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all." Now, would you agree that trauma is an affliction?
Yes, it is.
It's an affliction. And I put a note in my Bible that the Lord sometimes, many times, will get us out of the experience of the affliction. Maybe it happened years ago in our past, but the trauma itself is still there in our emotional life. And we're trying to find a way of living with it. Now, from our point of view as Christian in the healing ministry, what's the difficulty with trauma? They become a door point for a lot of negative emotions, don't they?
They do.
What are some of the things that you've seen come in with trauma?
I'll tell you a personal experience I had when I was 12 years old. I was swimming off the dock at my parents' place down at the beach, and I got caught up underneath the dock. And all I could see was the darkness below, and I panicked. Now, I could have not been under there 12 seconds, 15 seconds, because I saw the light and I was able to get up, and it was just amazing. Prior to that point, I had never had any kind of fear of being closed in or smothering. But I remember being under that water and pure panic set in that I was going to drown. I found sometime later after that when I started going into enclosed spaces, that same panic would come in. and I had claustrophobia set in and never had it before that event took place. I found that when I was having pillow fights with my brothers and sisters, if somebody got too close to the pillow to my face and tried to put it on me, I had a fear of smothering to death.
Yes.
And would actually lose total control. Now, prior to that event at 12 years old, closed in spaces, not feeling like I could breathe, was never, ever an issue in my life. Feeling like I was smothering was never an issue, but that traumatic, what I call a very real traumatic event of not being able to get out and knowing that I was going to drown, instilled a fear in me that developed a phobia that I had, two phobias that I had never had before. That was a door point in which the enemy walked in and convinced me that there was something wrong with me and I was living in fear because I was going to not be able to breathe and smother to death.
And then that led to other problems later in life. I remember you mentioned to me once you had trouble going through tunnels.
That's exactly right.
And it was that same closed-in feeling.
That's right.
A lot of people may experience this. People sometimes have a fear of getting on elevators.
Right.
Many of our characteristics, dreads, and phobias that follow us late into life have their beginning in some kind of childhood trauma. For instance, I pointed out the scar on my arm. I was a monkey in trees up until the time I jumped out of that tree and broke my arm. And I had just gotten too reckless. I think I was meant to learn a lesson that trees can be dangerous.
That's right.
But the lesson I learned was don't go back up into trees, or if you do, build a tree house. So my brother and I, from that point on, built tree houses. Now, that's kind of a humorous way of responding to trauma looking back. But for years, going up heights was a problem to me as a carpenter. I had to do it. I would push past it, but I carried it with me. And yet, God can mend these things.
He can mend them beyond our wildest dreams. Now, these two traumas that happened to you and I were something physical of an accident or a mishap. But there are so many other traumas that have come into your life and my life that have to do with people that we know, that have come in and left impressions or wounds, spiritual wounds in our souls that we may not even be able to recognize as a trauma.
But it will make us afraid to get close to people, like you were physically afraid to get close to people because of your particular trauma. Because we've been hurt and wounded by people, we'll emotionally not want to get close to them. We'll fear the rejection of people. The number one fear in America right now
is public speaking.
Fear of public speaking.
Why are we so afraid to talk in front of other people?
Yeah, and it goes back to this. We may have done show and tell in the classroom when we were kids, and everybody laughed at us when they weren't supposed to laugh.
Right.
Or we did a book report and got laughed at, or we felt the fear and anxiety of that and just said never again. And so there are a lot of things that we're hindered from entering into because of fears that come out of trauma.
That fear of speaking in front of people really goes back to fear of man. What will someone think of me? The spirit, my spirit that I will not be accepted.
That fear of man gets started.
That's
and there's a path of mending, and in our next show we're going to talk about that path of mending, but we still want to take time today to talk about trauma so that people can relate. Sometimes trauma is hard to recognize, folks, so I've got 3 ways to help people recognize the thoughts of trauma, and one is that sometimes they're painfully obvious. Sometimes we just know what our trauma is, and oftentimes out of that kind of event, we've carried such a sense of injustice that we're really on guard against the thing happening again. We don't want people getting too close to it because it's not a healed wound yet. This is a scar. A scar is a healed wound, but we may be carrying that kind of tender wound we don't want anybody close to, and we're always trying to hide it from people's eyes. But that's painfully obvious. Others may be partially buried. And in those kind of traumas, we shove them down and spend a lot of mental energy trying to keep them from coming back to the surface.
I know when I was 15 years old, I was responsible for a young boy drowning. And although it wasn't something that I meant to do, it just was an accident. But from that event of not being able to find him in the water, I was so traumatized that what was going to happen to me as a result of this boy losing his life. So afraid to get next to God, so afraid to anybody to get close to my heart because was I going to hurt them or somebody going to find out the horrible thing that I had done? And I lived with that up until about 4 years ago.
Well, if you would allow me to take that as a teaching moment, because
go right ahead.
This is so emblematic of the way that when a trauma happens, the enemy comes in and begins sowing lies like you're no good, you're worthless, you can't get close to God. The accusations, the fears begin to pile up on us. One of the names for the enemy in the Bible is the Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub. And flies are those things, aren't they, that love to come to a raw wound and love to infect a raw wound.
Yes.
And that is a grisly but real picture of what
That's
trauma
right.
happens. It's there that the lies collect. The final thing that I want to mention is sometimes trauma is hidden in plain sight. We feel like we've dealt with it, but we keep bringing it up.
That's
we
right.
keep telling the story over and over again, and everybody around us, if we had the courage to ask them, would say, you know what, you're not over that event yet.
I've heard that.
But we feel like we've been there and done that, and it's a done deal, but we can't stop talking about it.